Can I get a thumbs up if everybody can see my PowerPoint and see my screen? All right, perfect. Okay, let's get started. So today's class, the second class of our kind of mini series, will be on the Persian and Greek Empire. So last time we talked about the Mesopotamians and their empires and how they started the first cities, the first towns, and how they created this civilization out of nothing, thanks to the very fertile ground near the Mesopotamian and around the Mediterranean. So for today, we're going to talk about the empires that come after that. Particularly in this case, this will be the Persian and the Greek Empire. We talked about the Persian Empire a bit last time, but I just want to go through it again because I feel like it's a really important part of history and it will tie in really well with the Greek Empire at this time. All right, so last week we ended off our PowerPoint and our lesson on the Persian Empire and how they conquered the Babylonians. So do anybody remember anything about the Persian Empire? Yes, is it Yulin?
It's the last empire and it created the superpower. The last empire of Mesopotamia.
That is correct. Let's write that down. Give me a second. Sorry. That is absolutely correct. So we talked about that. So the Persian Empire was the last empire of Mesopotamia. All right. So that is absolutely correct. So what else? Does anybody have anything else about the Persian Empire that they might know? Yes, I see you raise your hand up, but could I ask your name? I don't see your name on your Zoom right now.
He was called Cyrus the Great, I think.
Perfect. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Cyrus the Great was the first king of Persia. Yeah, so we learned about how Cyrus the Great, the first king of Persia, conquered Mesopotamia and defeated the Babylonians so that he can create this pretty massive empire and dominate Mesopotamia and be really wealthy because, as we said before, the lands were very fertile in Mesopotamia. So living in that part of the of that world at that time in the ancient times, around 1000 BCE, was very prosperous. All right. So let's dive into some more details and some new information about the Persian Empire today. So, okay, what was special about the Persian Empire? There's something really important is that where we understand or get the information of Persia, we get most of our information from Persia from actually not from Persians themselves. We learn most of our understanding of Persia through a philosopher that goes by the name of Herodotus. So Herodotus was actually a Greek, so from Greece philosopher, and he wrote a book on Persia, and the book name was called he wrote about the book called The Persian War, and that was his inspiration to write about the Persian Empire because of their war and how interesting their wars were, because they were one of the greatest powers and greatest empires of the time. All right, any questions about that?
I have a question, but why do they have to be dressed like that?
Sorry?
Why do they have to be dressed like this?
Great question. Yeah. So this was kind of a very formal attire back then. So as this statue is actually the statue of Herodotus, the Greek philosopher that wrote about Persia. And usually this is how people wore their clothes back then, because they were usually drapes, and because these were easier clothes to wear, and because that part of the world is actually really hot. As we said, it was near this imaginary line called the equator. So countries and empires around that line was very hot. So this clothes also looked stylish back then, and it also made it so people don't get too heated, and like yeah. So this was to help their bodies breathe, because it's very light linen, and it was just something that was very comfortable back then. Alrighty, give me a second. Let's move on to the next page. Let's do this. Sorry, give me a second. All right, perfect. Can everybody still see my screen? Yep. All right, perfect. Yeah. So that's it for the Persian Empire, and let's move on to the Persian Conquest. So the lands that they took over. So from last week, most of you guys said that you guys remember that Persia actually took over Mesopotamia. Well, what else did they take over? Well, the other parts of the world that Persia was very famous for taking over was Egypt, and also the Indus Valley. So Egypt, so if this was Mesopotamia, we have over here Egypt, and we have the Indus Valley, this huge part to the east of Mesopotamia. Perfect. All right. So next, let's talk about why the Persians were actually called the model empires of the world. Well, although Persia was really into conquering a lot of land, and that seems like a bad thing, but they usually let all of the kings and queens of the places they conquer keep their royalty. So they get to keep their power and keep their wealth, as long as they pledge their allegiance or they remain loyal to the Persian Empire. They get to keep their royalty status, and they get to keep their wealth, which is a very good deal for those who got conquered, because they still get to enjoy all the power they had. And although Persia was kind of like a semi-dictatorship, and they had a lot of kingship, queenship, and a lot of royalty, they were actually pretty nice rulers. So Persians made money from the lands they conquered by collecting taxes. Even though taxes seem like a bad thing, the amount of taxes that the Persians collected weren't actually much. And usually when they collected this taxes, they used this tax to create infrastructure. So examples of infrastructures might be roads, houses, and also maybe to help the army so the people of the land can be safer. And yes.
Why is this woman not wearing clothes?
Yeah, I'm not sure. This is just a picture of Persia, and back then this is an artistic depiction. So a lot of art, a lot of this type of art usually have some nudity to it because it's what appealed to people back then. You can see a lot of more famous drawings and paintings in chapels in ancient Greek, in ancient Persia, with this type of painting.
It's kind of inappropriate because this woman is like out. Kind of showing too much skin.
Yeah. All right. So let's keep going. So we talked about how Persia was kind of this pretty good empire. They were pretty lenient to the people they conquered, letting them keep their power, keep the royalty, but they also collected taxes to help these conquered lands create better infrastructure to improve their lives. But they also had something that was very important. And well, that thing was the freedom of religion. The Persian Empire was one of the first empires to allow the freedom of religion because, through their own religion called Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism is kind of this really loose religion that the Persians followed, which allowed other religions to be in the picture. So this religion, Zoroastrianism, did not only contain one religion. Although they believed in this a few set of gods, but they also allowed other religions to exist. And one very important part of Zoroastrianism was the belief of freedom, which means that they actually didn't allow slaves, meaning that slaves were really, really uncommon within the Persian Empire, which is something kind of interesting because a lot of other empires at that time always had slaves. Whenever they conquered new land, they would usually enslave the people of the conquered land so they can get free labor and build better houses for themselves. All right, any questions on that? Is that Yili? You have a question?
It's about the picture. In the picture, why is the house on fire?
Oh yeah, good question. I'm actually not sure, but I believe that this picture is a picture of the Persians conquering a land. So you can see that the Persian Empire over on this side and the people that got conquered on this side. So of course, it's still war. Although they are pretty lenient on how they ruled, those who rebelled against them, they didn't take lightly. So they would usually behead and execute people that did not believe in the Persian Empire and are rebelling. So yeah, that's
what does rebelling mean?
Rebelling means going against. So say I'm the Persian Empire. If somebody doesn't like me, they will try to fight me or take me down. That's called rebelling. They don't want the Persian Empire anymore, so they rebel.
Then what do they say? What if you lost?
So yeah, that's absolutely possible. So rebellions, some win, some loses. If a rebellion loses, nothing really happens. The empire still continues. But if the rebellion wins, maybe there's going to be a change in government. So new people become government and there's going to be a new leader.
Oh, that's nice, but I have a question. How much money does the taxes pay? Like, how much people do they pay the money? The money.
So you mean how much taxes they pay? Is that your question?
Yeah.
All right, good question. So the amount of taxes they pay actually depends, right, on how much people make. Usually the amount of taxes people pay is by percentages. So depending on how much you earn, you pay a percent of that, maybe 10%, 15%. So the more you earn, the more taxes you have to pay. But this means that it is more equal to everybody around you.
Oh, so the more you have, and then the next time you have to pay a lot.
Yep,
The same.
that's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
You pay $1, and then next time you pay $1.
Then they will come find you because you're not paying your taxes. And that was something that empires rely on. Taxes, so they can create better armies, better infrastructure, so they can conquer more land. Because wealth is everything. All right. I'll have one more question from Lyndon and we'll move on.
So the question is, what is the other like people, like the black circles one?
The black circles one?
The circled black one.
Okay, good question. So those people are just rebellers, people that didn't listen to the Persian army. And you can see troops around these rebellions to kind of group them in so they can take them somewhere else to punish them or take them to jail. All right, let's move on. So we talked about the Persian Empire and we just wrapped things up from what we learned last week. So let's now get into the Greek Empire. So what was the Greek Empire really famous for? Well, there was 4 things that they were really famous for. Philosophy, architecture, literature, and also music. Those are the 4 things that the Greeks were really famous for. And well, I would just go through them a bit. So philosophy is kind of the understanding of the human nature and also nature itself. So it's a lot of questions that are usually unsolvable or questions that just make you think more. That's philosophy. Architecture, pretty straightforward, buildings. The Greek Empire had one of the most beautiful buildings within empires. They had really grand buildings, a lot of monuments to a lot of gods that they admire. Literature, they had a lot of books, and this really ties into philosophy too. A lot of philosophers, such as Plato, talked a lot because they were philosophers. They would talk about a lot of philosophy, and usually their students would write down, and this becomes their type of literature. One of the famous literature pieces was the Menno. Sorry?
What is philosophy?
Yeah, so I was explaining that. Philosophy is a study of humans, of nature, of everything in the world. So the study of the world and asking these great questions on what is the meaning of life and discussing these with other people. And yeah, so example of a philosophy question is going to be the allegory of the cave. I'm not sure if you guys heard of it, but I can show you, give me a second, I can show you guys really quick. It's really interesting, and it's a really good example of philosophy. Yep, okay, so this is the story of the allegory of the cave by Plato. So what is the allegory of the cave? Well, you can see the allegory of the cave is a picture or a thought experiment for people to think. That's what philosophy is based on. Philosophy, in this case, the allegory of the cave talks about people who are chained up for their entire lives and only shown these pictures well, you can see on the wall, these pictures on the wall. That's all they knew their entire life. But there's actually a whole entire world out of that because they're stuck in a cave. And the question here is that what is real and what is not? If you bring these people that live their whole life in this cave outside into the real world, would they think that the real world is real or the cave is real? Because you see, they're two separate things now. And these people believe that because they've seen these pictures or these animations their whole life, that's the real thing, that's the real world. So they won't believe when they come out of the cave that that is the actual real world. They will believe that their eyes are playing a trick on them. And also, that also applies the other way through. We believe that the outside is real and this picture is fake, but in their perspective, it's actually the other way around. So the question from this really famous Plato's thought experiment is what is real and what is not. And maybe you guys heard of the movie The Matrix? Nope. No, okay, yeah. So it's a really great movie from 2000, and it features Keanu Reeves, and it's one of the most famous movies and one of the best movies to be made. And I encourage you guys to watch it and explore this idea of the allegory of the cave. What is real and what is not. All right. Let's go back to our slides. Let's keep going. So we talked about the Greek Empire and their idea of philosophy, literature, architecture, music. What else are they famous for? Well, they're also really famous for democracy. The Greek Empire, specifically Athens, was democratic. So people could vote for their leader and have a democratic leader. So people vote for, and the majority makes all of the bigger decisions. And yeah, the Greek Empire, Athens, really started the first modern idea of democracy, where people are elected and where a government is representative of the population. So the population actually makes all of the big decisions. All right. So that's all of the really big Greek Empire contributions to the world. But something that most people find really funny, but most people don't know, is that the Greeks also, the Greek, or specifically one Greek playwright, kind of is called the father of comedy. He's the first person to incorporate comedy into his playwright. And his name was Aristophanes. So Aristophanes was this Greek playwright. So a playwright is somebody who writes plays, who lived in Athens, Greece. And he's known as the father of comedy because he was really well known to have these kind of jokes in these really dark and really sad plays, which is kind of fun. And yeah, so most people believe that Aristophanes was the person that invented having jokes in plays, and specifically, he was really famous for inventing the fart jokes. So Athens Greek was the first place where fart jokes started up, because in his plays, you can see he constantly likes to have jokes that contain poop. So there is examples of him having a joke where he makes everybody imagine him throwing a poop at a fellow playwright that he didn't like. So yeah, so that is something really tiny, but kind of interesting in the history of Athens. All right, let's get back to talking about Athens and their history. So the Greek Empire, it wasn't really a huge empire like Persia. Persia had one ruler and he ruled over everything within Persia itself. However, the Greek Empire was actually made out of really small territories. We don't call them that territories, but we actually call them city-states. So these really small pieces of land that are controlled by one government, and the government usually lived in the city. So each city you see on the map here usually had one ruler, one government, democratic, or maybe not, a government that ruled over this city. And so what is special about these cities? Well, these city-states were kind of these small individual little countries because they were free to act by themselves. There was no such thing as the Greek Empire at that time. There were these really small kind of cities that controlled everything. Unfortunately, in these cities, there was actually a lot of slavery. Slavery was really common in the Greek empires. Even though Greek Empire is portrayed as this very, very grandiose empire, they actually had a lot of slavery to make all of that happen. And another unfortunate part was citizenship.
I have a question.
Yeah, let me finish this and you can ask the question. So citizenship back then in these city-states were very limited. Most people couldn't get their citizenship, so their right to be a citizen in this city, unless they had land, they had wealth, and they have some kind of connection. Most importantly, only men were allowed citizenship. So women weren't allowed the right to own a citizenship or be part of a citizen in the cities, and they didn't have the right to vote. And yeah, these cities, I was talking about a lot of these different city-states, but these city-states are actually very different from each other. There are city-states that are democratic, like Athens, but there's also city-states like Sparta that were a full dictatorship, and they had different goals that their cities wanted and their governments want to achieve. So although you kind of see Greece, but at this time, the Greek Empire was actually really divided into these really small parts called the city-states, where these different cities have different goals and they have different values too. All right, I'll take any questions you guys have right now. Lyndon, you have a question?
What are Athens, or what is Athens?
Okay, good question. So what is Athens? Well, Athens is another city-state. So Athens is a city-state. So again, Athens is just a city, but it is a very powerful city because of its rich culture. They had a lot of philosophers. Most of the philosophers are from Athens, and they had a very democratic system. So democratic, again, just means that people had the right to vote, and people were free, and their population controlled the government instead of having one dictatorship that controlled everything. All right, any other questions? Nope. All right, if there's no questions, let's move on. All right, let's click that. So we were talking about Persia, the Persian Empire, and also Greece, the Greek Empire. And well, the main reason I talked about the Persian Empire and now the Greece is because I want to focus on their war. So there was a war that started between Greece and Persia because of a group of people called the Ionian Greeks. And these people lived in a city called Anatolia. So it's one of the city-states of Greece, which is near the Persian border. So these Ionian Greeks were actually rebelling against the Persian. And yeah, so because the Ionian Greeks were rebelling against Persia in Anatolia, this made the Persian Empire really mad because, of course, they didn't want anybody to rebel and not listen to them, right? But what was made worse was then Athens, as we're saying, which is very wealthy and very rich in culture, they supported the rebellion. Which made the Persian Empire even madder because this war or this rebellion should have nothing to do with Athens because they're so far west that this shouldn't concern them. But of course, because they're both Greek, quote unquote Greek, the Athens thought that, yeah, we of course should help the Ionian Greeks in the rebellion. So the Persian king, his name was Xerxes, was really, really furious because he was really mad that, well, that the Athens people were actually helping the Ionian Greeks win a war against Persia. So what the Persian king did was that he started a campaign, so a war effort against Athens. What happened was that Athens, because they were scared that Persia was going to overrun them, because Persia was actually really powerful, they asked the other city-states for help. So then it became a war from Persia, not only against Athens, but also Persia against all of the city-states of Greece, which is a humongous part of land, and they were all very powerful because of how they ruled themselves and also their location. So this made the war against Athens really hard because now Persia is not just fighting Athens, but all of the city-states in Greece. So what happened was that because of this help from the city-states, Athens actually won the war from Persia and actually start seeing themselves as one big country. Because back then, as I said, these are a lot of small city-states that have their own goals. But because of this win, so again, the Athens won the war because of the help from the city-states. So because Athens won this war, and again, and kind of Greece itself won a really big war. So what happens was that because of this kind of united all of these city-states into one, thinking that, wow, if we united together, we can be much more powerful. So that's what they did. They united into one big country, now we know it's called Greece, but back then they didn't call that, they didn't have Greece. And they made the capital of this newfound country from this small city-states, Athens. So the new capital of Greece was Athens. All right. So we were talking about how Persia was actually not a bad country. Although it was a dictatorship, it was actually a pretty free place to live in. They didn't have slaves, and they had the freedom of religion, and they helped the land that got conquered to be more prosperous by building more infrastructure. So even though Athens won, was it actually, did the right, there was a lot of debate within historians asking if the right side won the war. So was it right that Greece and Athens won the war, or should it be better that Persians won the war? Well, there's arguments on both sides. Those who believe that Greece and Athens should win the war was due to their democracy. They believe that Greece had to win the war or should win the war because of democracy. They had this new modern idea of democratic voting and just having the population be recognized within government. And they believe that if Athens actually lost the war, that would have never happened. So we would never get modern democracy. So there wouldn't be Canada, there wouldn't be United States, there wouldn't be United Kingdoms with their thought of democracy where the people rule. However, there's also a counter argument to that. We saw that, I was talking about how Athens wasn't actually the prettiest city-state to live in, or Greece wasn't the prettiest country to live in because they had a lot of slavery. slavery was really common within Athens, and also citizenship. So nobody, people were less equal in Athens. Not a lot of people can get citizenship. So even though there was a democracy and people can vote, not everybody can vote. So the other side of the argument was that Persia should have won the war because even though they're a democracy, they're much better living condition in that time because they allowed a lot of freedoms that other empires didn't allow. So yeah, those are the two sides of war. Some people think the Persians should have won. Some people think that Athens should have won. So maybe keep that in mind and just think about that. Not everything in history is really simple. So there isn't always a bad guy and a good guy, but sometimes it's about perspective. So where you're standing for the war. All right. So
that was kind of scary. The speaking was kind of scary.
So yeah. So again, Sparta was one of the city-states in Athens, and there were a lot of warriors. So Sparta was actually a warrior state. So a lot of people there were fighters. So yeah, of course, and that was their king Leonidas. All right, so let's get back to our PowerPoint. All right. So yeah, so we talked about Persia and their empire. So next part of this would sorry. So that was the war against Greece and Persia. Next, we're gonna look at a war that happened after this. We knew that Athens, Sparta, and again Greece won the war against Persia. So Persia is not defeated. But I was talking about how this country was made out of these small city-states. Well, these city-states didn't always necessarily get along because they had different ideas. Again, Athens being more democratic and Sparta being more dictatorship and having different goals, with Sparta actually liking warriors and liking to fight a lot, where when Athens just want to be peaceful and have a lot of philosophical discussions. So what happens when there's one country but with a lot of different ideologies that are kind of conflicting? Well, you have the wars within a country. You have, in this case, the Spartans versus the Athenians. So this will be Spartans who kind of represent the kingship. So any city-states that believed in having a king, having royalty, and having dictatorship, versus all of those states that believed in democracy. So I prepared another small video about this topic because it's pretty complicated, and maybe the video will do a better job on explaining why this conflict happened and what was the consequences of this conflict.
You're muted.
Yep.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. So that was a short video on the Peloponnesian War, or the war when Spartans versus Athenians. Does anybody have any questions on that war? Nope. Everybody clear?
I have one.
Yep. Linda?
What happened after the war?
Great question. So again, as the video said, after the war, Greece was out of a lot of things. They didn't have a big army because a lot of soldiers got killed, and they were really weak. They didn't have a lot of money because wars cost a lot of money to fight. So they were broke, and they didn't have any troops to defend themselves. So this is where somebody comes in. Somebody called, maybe you guys know somebody called Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great's father actually comes in and kind of defeats this really huge empire, the Greek Empire, because of their internal fights. And we'll be learning about that next week in more details. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, nope. That means that most of you guys understood everything on today's lesson. All right, that is the end of the lesson today. So you guys are free to go, and I'll see you guys next week. But if you have any questions, stick around and feel free to ask them.
Bye.